I'm Daniel Minty, a cognitive behavioral therapist, teacher, and writer. Autobiographical memory is a fund of knowledge about who and how we are. It forms the basis of our sense of self and is the ground of our beliefs about ourselves, other people, and the world at large. A subset of this data, memories of distressing experiences, are included in the diagnostic criteria for a number of psychiatric disorders, including PTSD and obsessive compulsive disorder. Such memories are oftentimes intrusive, repetitive, and can trigger intense negative emotion via the same neuronal pathways that process perception. A flashback is less a memory of an event than an event in and of itself. Most of us, most of the time, can set aside unwanted memories. We suppress the retrieval of this content via top-down modulation of hippocampal activity by the prefrontal cortex. We tell ourselves, I'm not going to think about that, and we don't. PTSD patients, however, may repeatedly struggle and fail to do the same thing. Structural and functional changes in the brains of these patients may be stacking the deck against them. The link between memory and self-perception is clinically significant because distorted self-perceptions are at the core of many disorders. We could add to those I've mentioned depression, social anxiety, and personality and eating disorders. Negative self-perceptions encapsulate patients' self-defeating beliefs about themselves, others, and the world at large. Such perceptions often arise in a context of abuse, neglect, or bullying, and trap patients in a vicious cycle of self-criticism, negative emotion, and maladaptive behavior. Memory rescripting is a method we can offer such patients. It's shown efficacy as a standalone treatment and in combination with CBT. Rescripting can proceed in a number of ways. I'll describe two of them, provide a brief overview of the outcome literature on rescripting, then share examples of each from my clinical practice. In one approach, rescripting modifies the content of aversive memories, creating more benign recollections that can then compete in an inhibitory way with the original memory. Interestingly, though patients who rescript in this way know their new memory doesn't follow the fact pattern of the historical event, they nonetheless report the new content helps them in precisely the places the original content created suffering. Rescripting may act in these cases like placebo. Many patients who knowingly ingest a placebo report improvement as great as that reported by patients who receive an actual medication. Harvard University researcher Ted Kaptchuk has demonstrated that up to 50% of the relief that asthma patients experience from a beta agonist like albuterol is attributable to placebo. A second approach to rescripting leaves the original fact pattern in place, but shifts one's perception of those facts, and thus beliefs about oneself associated with the old perception. When successful, recall of the memory acquires a new meaning and is now associated with a new sense of self. A man who previously identified simply as a victim of sexual assaults may now experience himself as a resilient, resourceful survivor. Previous feelings of terror, helplessness, and shame associated with the event might now be replaced with feelings of pride, gratitude, and self-assurance. A recent meta-analysis of 19 clinical trials, including 363 adult patients, found very promising outcome data associated with memory rescripting. Study diagnoses included PTSD, OCD, social anxiety, body dysmorphic disorder, depression, and bulimia. Rescripting was administered over an average of 4.5 sessions. The analysis found a post-treatment effect size of 0.9, an astonishingly strong outcome from a relatively short course of therapy. I've provided links to this and 2 other studies at the end of this video. While in graduate school in Baltimore, I studied as well at the Milton Erickson Institute there. While doing so, I offered free hypnosis sessions to my fellow students who were suffering from things like test anxiety. One of my friends had endured a neglectful and chaotic childhood. Other kids had birthday parties and Christmas Eves, not her. She was sad about her bleak history and wondered if hypnosis could help. I consulted with my mentor at the Institute, and we designed a 1-session intervention. It took a page from Erickson's work and is an example of rescripting that supplies new content. I enlisted my colleague Tom, the psychologist on the inpatient unit where I worked. Tom reminded me of Fred Rogers, wonderfully sweet, fun, human guy. In the session, I induced a trance and then did an age regression with Susan back to about 1st grade. I then set the Christmas Eve scene, including stockings that had, in fact, for the first time, been hung by the chimney with care. On cue, Tom knocked at the office door. "Who could that be?" I asked Susan. Eyes wide, her voice now 6 years old, not 30, ventured, "Santa?" "Let's find out," I told her. "Who's there?" "Ho, ho, ho," Tom replied, stepping inside. The next 20 minutes were among the most magical of my clinical career. I think all 3 of us were sharing the same altered state. Santa and Susan had a lovely chat, and she experienced for the first time what other kids experience as a matter of course. It's important to note she really experienced this. Her body, as well as her mind, were steeped in this reality. And I could almost see her autobiographical fund of knowledge and sense of self resetting before my eyes. Before ending, I gave Susan the choice of remembering her meeting with Santa on a conscious level or holding it as a private treasure in her heart. I don't know for sure, but I think she chose the latter, as she never spoke with me about this again. Some weeks later, before class, I asked in a general way about Susan's recollections of childhood. She gave me a wonderful Mona Lisa smile and said, "Well, Daniel, for a long time, I told people it was nothing to write home about." In my book, Reclaiming Life After Trauma, I write about rescripting a traumatic memory that left the facts in place, but allowed them to acquire a new meaning. While in middle school, Paul had been sexually abused by an older stepbrother. Now in his mid-30s, Paul had not seen this stepbrother for many years. Yet when having sex with his wife, Paul had flashbacks of this abuse that frightened and angered him, confused both him and his wife. He began to feel hopeless and bitter, telling himself he'd never be able to have an intimate encounter that didn't include his stepbrother and memories of what he'd done. I explained rescripting to Paul. In the book, we call this method return to the scene. Paul bravely agreed to try the method, and we set up an extended therapy session in which to do so. It began with Paul closing his eyes and getting physically comfortable in a big chair. I had Paul do some abdominal breathing and invited him to notice that he was feeling very relaxed and even a bit dreamy. Within minutes, he'd entered a light trance state. I then invited Paul to walk back into the setting in which he had been abused and describe it aloud to me in as much detail as possible. I asked about the sights, sounds, and smells in the room. We then brought in the younger Paul. The two hugged each other and said how happy they were to be together. The younger Paul spoke about his fear, loneliness, shame, and confusion about what was happening. Present-day Paul wept and expressed his anger, sadness, and desire to protect and reassure his younger self. We then brought in Paul's stepbrother, and both Pauls told him everything that neither Paul had ever had the opportunity to express. Stepbrother sat silently, listened until they were done, and then left the room. Finally, the two Pauls said goodbye, the older reassuring the younger that all would be well, and the younger thanking the older for coming back after all these years. After this heartfelt encounter, Paul's flashbacks began to change. He said it was as though the bulb in a movie projector began to dim. The flashbacks continued for a while, but each time they were fainter and fainter. At the same time, Paul's present-day experience became brighter and brighter. He felt increasingly connected to his wife and able to focus on this connection while having sex with her. On his own, Paul returned a few more times to hang out with his younger self. Months later, Paul told me he had come to see his former flashbacks in a new light. They now seemed to be not about his stepbrother, but about his relationship with his younger self. It was the younger Paul who had kept reaching out in this way, knowing how important it was for the older Paul to connect with him. Once they reconnected, Paul's entire emotional life and all the relationships in it took on a new warmth, closeness, and satisfaction. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked what you've seen, consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for the memories, and I'll look forward to reconnecting with you soon.